Hi everyone. In this video we're going to talk about how cells are organized, and we're going to go over these first two learning outcomes. These are the same two that are on your study guide. So the first thing we want to talk about is the difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. And you might hear me call those prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So if we look at cells, the basic unit of life, we can group them into two categories, the prokaryotes and the eukaryotes. And the major difference is it's actually even stated in the name. Pro means before, karyot means nucleus. So these cells evolved before the nucleus did. Eu means true, karyot means nucleus. So these are the cells that evolved a true nucleus. And that's the first and most major obvious difference between these two kinds of cells. The prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus and eukaryotes do. And you can see those in a light microscope like the one we would normally use in lab. The other thing that you'll notice is prokaryotic cells are much smaller than eukaryotic cells in general. And you know a little bit about the organisms. You've heard of the organisms that are prokaryotes and eukaryotes. The prokaryotes are two groups of bacteria, which you would hear called eubacteria and archaebacteria. In the questions for this section, in the lecture assignment, it'll ask you, what are the prokaryotes? And it's going to say eubacteria and archaebacteria. For my purposes, if you can just say the prokaryotes are bacteria, that's good enough for the lecture exam. The eukaryotes are things like plants and animals, fungi, as well as some organisms called protists. And you've heard of protists because you've heard of amoebas and euglenas and things like that. So make sure you're kind of familiar with the distinctions between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Now, we're going to spend more time talking about eukaryotes right now, and primarily because this is human biology, and I want you to know features of humans. But all cells, whether you're prokaryotes or eukaryotes, have an outer layer called a plasma membrane. Now, you're probably familiar with the idea that the plasma membrane's made from a phospholipid bilayer. And we talked about lipids when we talked about chemistry. Remember, we said lipids don't dissolve in water. And so it makes sense that the outside of all cells is going to have a layer that doesn't dissolve in water. So we call this layer the plasma membrane. And that's going to control what goes in and out of the cell. The other part of the cell of all cells, whether you're prokaryote or eukaryote, is you have a cytoplasm, and that's the fluid inside of a cell, as well as the organelles that are floating around in there, or the molecules. So the cytoplasm is going to have all the stuff inside of a cell. And some of that stuff inside of the cell some of those things are going to be organelles. And it says here, organelles are internal compartments that have specialized functions. And that actually gets us to one of probably the fourth difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes, and that is that prokaryotic cells, not only do they not have a nucleus, but they don't have any other organelles that are surrounded by membranes. And so we're going to talk about some of those organelles as we talk about eukaryotic cells. I know in the lab assignment questions, it has some of these pictures and asks you to label them. And I don't go over all of the organelles, but they might ask you to label some things that I didn't ask you about. And so you'll be able to figure them out. I just can't take out one or two out of the questions. So they might be, like I said, some there that you don't have to know, but you'll know which ones you do need to know based when you look at your lecture study guide. Okay, so let's go to this big picture and just do a quick review of the parts of a cell, particularly the ones I want you to know. And so this is a eukaryotic cell, and this picture is really great because it has a really good summary of the parts and what they do. So the parts we've already talked about is we said there's a cytoplasma membrane, that's a phospholipid bilayer on the outside, controls what goes in and out of the cell. There's that nucleus, so when you look under a microscope, you can see that, and hopefully you're aware that the nucleus contains the genetic material. One of the words that we're going to see when we talk about the nucleus in a little bit more detail is the chromatin. And the chromatin is actually the DNA and some proteins mixed together. So the genetic material, that DNA inside the nucleus plus some proteins, is the chromatin. If we go back over here, another vocabulary word is the cytoskeleton. And so the cytoskeleton is what it sounds like, cytocell, and you guys all know what a skeleton is. And there's actually these fibers that are all through cells, and they give the cell structure, and it gives some of these organelles things to hold on to so they don't all just kind of group together in one part of the cell. And there's some details here that you don't need to know. Just know the general function of a cytoskeleton. In one of the questions in the lab assignment, they ask you about centrioles and centrosomes, but I'm not going to ask you about those. I am going to ask you about lysosomes, though. And look at that. It's just a little membrane pocket there. And they're actually lysosomes all over the place inside of cells. Cells like white blood cells have a lot more lysosomes, and lysosomes tend to contain digestive enzymes to remove debris from the cell, to remove debris from the body. And so that debris can be foreign things like bacteria, or it can just be your own dying and damaged cells. So lysosomes, some people call it the garbage disposal of a cell. I go over here, we have this stuff called Endoplasmic Reticulum, and you can see all these folds. And then there's some more out here. So we have the rough ER and the smooth ER. And the rough ER has ribosomes on it. The ribosomes are the structures that carry out protein synthesis. They make the proteins. So when we look at the function of the rough ER, it's involved in protein synthesis. It also contributes to making proteins. Hopefully in the chemistry section, I convinced you that proteins are really, really important. So there's the lots and lots of ribosomes, those little dots all over the ER. Actually, you can see there's some ribosomes on the nucleus too. And it turns out there's ribosomes in the cytoplasm just floating around. So making proteins is a huge job for a cell. There's also these membranes out here that are called smooth ER, and they're smooth because they don't have ribosomes all over them, but they help make certain kinds of lipids. And then the final structure I want you to be familiar with as far as a cell structure is a mitochondria. And I think a lot of people have heard of those. You always hear them called the powerhouse of the cell. And that's because mitochondria take our food in the form of glucose usually and produce energy. And the energy that it's converted into is a molecule called ATP. So ATP is an energy carrying molecule. So the mitochondria takes food and generates ATP. It says the site of cellular respiration and ATP production. Cellular respiration is something we're going to talk about in this lecture, and it's a way that cells take glucose and make ATP converted into a usable form of energy for the cell. I think that's all I have in this section, and there's some great videos if you want to watch them, but in fact, and there's a couple questions that you can answer. Good luck.